So our next adventure in solving quadratic equations for 930 is a brand new method called completing the square. This is a pretty cool method that's actually going to combine the two types of solving quadratic equations that you learned before the quiz. So it's going to combine solving with square roots with factoring. It's pretty cool. It's kind of a shortcut method to kind of get the best of both worlds, but you do have to remember one of the shortcuts that we learned from back in Unit 6, Part 1, which was the bin squared shortcut. But I'm going to show you how to do this new method called completing the square. So to warm up, I want you to start factoring some of these. I'll give you a hint if you know your bin squared shortcut that will come in handy on these. But just as a warm up, think back to Unit 6, Part 1, and remember how to factor. So many of you maybe drew out a factor box for that first one, right? You maybe perhaps did this and you said, all right, x squared would go up here. 64 would go up here, 16x, whoops, sorry about that, would go down in the nook, and you say, all right, well, that would have to be x times x to give me x squared. Let's see, what multiplies together to give 64? Well, the one that jumps out at us would be 8 times 8, and then let's check it. Oh, look at that, 8x plus 8x does give me 16x. And so then my parentheses that I would be writing down are x plus 8 times x plus 8, or x plus 8 squared. But if you remembered your bin squared shortcut, right, that would have saved you a ton of time. So you say, okay, well, is that first term a perfect square? It sure is. What times itself gives me x squared? X. Is that last term a perfect square? It sure is. What times itself gives me 64? It would be 8. And then you do a double check, right? And you multiply 8 times x is 8x, and you double it and you'd get 16x. Boom, there's that middle term, and I would have been done right there. So that bin squared shortcut would have been the fastest way to do that problem, but you could have used the factor box if you wanted to. All right, so getting in that mindset of the bin squared shortcut. So if you're going to find the missing term here, let's see, well, x squared plus 4x plus 4. Okay, well, that would factor into, okay, well, I know x squared gave me x, so I say, oh, what multiplies by itself to give me 4? Well, that would have to be 2, right? And then you could do a double check here. If you did 2 times x, you get 2x. You double it, you get 4x. Sure enough, that's got to be an x. That's got to be a 2. All right, similar idea here on the next one. X times x gives me x squared. You say, okay, well, what times itself gives me 25? All right, it's got to be 5. Multiply those together. X times 5 is 5x. Double it, I get, oh, hang on, though. I'm supposed to get negative 10x, which means that this needs to be a negative 5. Now, normally we would probably replace that plus sign with a minus sign, but the idea is that you got to watch that middle term to see if you're going to have a positive or a negative in those parentheses, so be careful. Now in part C, we were kind of working backwards a little bit, and we said, okay, well, if I know that my bin squared is going to be x plus 10, well, that means that this third term of my trinomial would have to be 10 squared, which is 100. Usually you guys are pretty good at the, like kind of going back and thinking about those bin squared problems. But this is truly what you just did is setting yourself up perfectly for that job of completing the square. All right, so like I told you at the beginning, this all comes down to that shortcut that we learned way back in Unit 6, Part 1, the bin squared shortcut. So make sure that you have this in your notes right now. Write it down, right? Because we are going to be using this a ton in order to be able to solve our quadratic equations. So remember that what you're looking for is this perfect square trinomial, right? perfect square trinomial is, you know, a polynomial that's 3 terms that would factor into a bin squared, right? It's a perfect square. Binomial squared would give you this trinomial. Remember again what you're looking for there. First term is a perfect square, last term is a perfect square. The middle term is when you take your 2 terms from your parentheses, you multiply them together, and you double it. And what that gets you then is over here, which is your binomial squared. Okay, so notice again, if we get a perfect square trinomial, I would get, you know, a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, and that would factor into a plus b squared. So we're going to use that idea. So what we want to do now is I just want to start by seeing if I could fill in that blank, kind of like we did in the second half of our warm-up, where I just want to make this into a perfect square trinomial. What number would have to go in that blank to make this the perfect square trinomial? And really how we're able to figure that out is to actually do that factoring. Use the bin squared shortcut, find the binomial, and work backwards to fill in that blank. So the first step in all of these is to actually get your binomial squared parentheses set up and start using that shortcut. So we say, okay, well, I know the first term, this is like a squared, right? And this first term in my parentheses is really a. So what times itself gives me x squared? X. All right. Now I can't quite figure out b yet, but I know that this middle term, this is 2ab, right? From my bin squared shortcut, it's a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, right? Those are my 3 terms. So this middle term is 2ab. So if I divide by 2, 12x divided by 2 gives me 6x. 6x would just be a times b, right? Okay, well, if a times b is 6x, and I know that a is x, then b has to be, well, what times x gives me 6x? It has to be 6. And if I look and double check, it has to be a positive 6 because I'm supposed to get a positive 12x in the middle. So that in order to find b, you have to take that middle term and divide out the 2. If you divide out the 2, then you end up with a times b, and you already know a. So you should be able to figure out b. All right, so I've just found b for my binomial, and now I know that, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this term and I'm going to square it, and that's what goes in my blank. 6 squared is 36. So 36 is what would fill out that perfect square trinomial. All right, so we did a lot of talking there, but hopefully that process isn't too confusing to you. So again, open up your binomial squared parentheses, and we start by finding a. So this first term is a squared. What times itself gives me x squared? That would be x. All right, so I found a. Now I know my middle term is 2ab, so I'm going to divide my middle term by 2, so I get just a times b. So negative 26x divided by 2 is negative 13x. And please make sure that you are writing this down. It will catch little mistakes a lot. All right, so now we say, okay, what times x gives me negative 13x? That would be negative 13, right? So then I fill in my blank up here by doing this, what I just found for b, and I need to square it. Negative 13 squared gives me positive 169. All right, so make sure, watch your negatives there. The number that you fill in that blank with should never be negative because it is something squared. And when you square something, you can never have a negative answer. All right, last one here kicks it up a notch. It's a little bit trickier. Don't get too math robot-y and get caught on this one. So again, first thing we do is figure out a. This one's different though. This is 4x squared. What times itself gives me 4x squared? That would be 2x, right? Okay, now I take my middle term and I divide it by 2. I get positive 6x. Now, this is the tricky part because you have to say, here's my little thought bubble that I'm going to do. We're going to bring it down here. Well, it will say 2x times what equals 6x. Remember, because we already know that a is 2x, and I need to figure out what's going to go in that other spot, right? 2x times what gives me 6x? 2x times 3. So this is positive 3. It is not 6 because a wasn't just x. A was 2x, right? If I did that same process over here, so on this thought bubble, it was x times what gives me negative 13x, right? Because x, or a, was just plain x. So that's why this one was just negative 13. But here, a was 2x. And so that's why that blank isn't just the 6 that I get when I divide by 2. And so that's why it's extremely important that you write down what you get when you divide it by 2. It's going to help catch some mistakes. All right, now my b this time is 3. And so I square it to fill in the blank. It would be a 9. Okay. Now, if you're ever wondering, ooh, did I do the right thing on that one? You know, just go back and do your shortcut again. Get that bin squared shortcut out and say, okay, well, a squared, 2x squared gives me 4x squared. Okay, b squared, 3 squared gives me 9. And then multiply your two terms together and double it to see if you get the middle term from your original problem. 2x times 3 is 6x. Double it, I get 12x, and it does work. So you can always check your answers on these as well. All right, now, you just completed this perfect square trinomial. That is what you're going to use, that process you're going to use in order to actually solve some equations. So that's what I'm going to show you now. So notice now we have our actual equations with our equal signs. So I see x squared plus 14x equals 15. So on the left, I have this beginning, right? It's kind of like what I had up here on the last slide. I have this x squared plus 12x. Well, here I have x squared plus 14x. What I want to do is I want to create that blank in my equation in order to complete that perfect square trinomial. So the first step is set up your equation by adding a blank. So x squared plus 14x plus blank, so that it looks like the ones that we did on the last slide, equals. Now here's the thing. If I add something on the left-hand side of an equation, I have to add something on the right-hand side of the equation as well. I have to add the same thing, right? In order to keep my equation balanced, whatever I add to the left, I have to add to the right. So if you think about what we just did up here where we found the number that goes in that blank, well, whatever number I put in that blank, when I have an equation, I have to put in a blank on the other side of the equal sign as well. So now we go through the same process that we just did to find that perfect square trinomial, right? That third spot in the perfect square trinomial, and then we'll continue after that in order to solve. But right now, the process is exactly what we've just been doing. So I open up my binomial squared, right? My binomial squared parentheses. Now, same process, right? What times itself gives me x squared? X times itself gives me x squared. There's a. Now I take my middle term and I have to divide it by 2. 14x divided by 2 is 7x. So a times b is 7x. So x times what gives me 7x? And the answer is 7, positive 7, since I need a positive 14x. And then I say, okay, I'm going to take that 7, I'm going to square it. So in the blank goes a 49. Now if I have 49 on the left, I have to add 49 on the right as well. Notice the blanks are the same color. You fill in, it's the same blank, so put the same number on both sides. look at this now. We actually have the next step of our process already done. I have factored the left-hand side. All I have to do is figure out what is 15 plus 49 on the right-hand side. 15 plus 49 gives me, let's see, 50, 64. So the process of completing that perfect square trinomial actually does the next step of solving for you. It's factored. There's the factoring part of this completing the square process. But now take a look at this. I have something squared, my parentheses squared, all by itself over on the left-hand side. Well, that's pretty easy to get rid of that square root, or that squared, and it's to take a square root. We learned that in our first lesson of this unit. To undo a squared, we square root. So those cancel. So I get x plus 7 equals, let's see, what times itself gives me 64? 8 or -8. Don't forget your plus or minus, right? Oop, I wrote -6. Sorry about that. Don't forget your plus or minus. When you write the square root sign in order to solve, the next step has to be positive or negative. And just like I showed you back on the first lesson of this unit, in this situation, I highly recommend that you write them separately because we're not finished solving. Next thing we have to do is subtract 7 from both of our possibilities, right? So x could equal 1, or it could equal -15. And check that out. There's our two answers for our quadratic equation, just like we're used to seeing with our other methods. So you add the blanks into your equation. You complete that perfect square trinomial. In the process of completing the square, you actually factor that trinomial already. Once you're factoring it, you got that bin squared, you square root both sides to get rid of the squared, boom, factoring and square roots combined into the same method. All right, let's try it one more time. Hopefully it will make sense on this one as well. So first step in completing the square is that I need to add a blank on both sides of my equation, because if I add something on the left, I have to also add it on the right. All right, then to start the process out, I get my bin squared parentheses all prepped and ready. I say, all right, what times itself gives me that first term? That would be x. I take my middle term and I divide it by 2. Now careful, watch your negative signs here. -6x divided by 2 gives me -3x. I say x times what gives me -3x? That would be -3. Now, I take that -3 and I square it. Remember, -3 times -3 is +9. Make sure that whatever you put in that blank is a positive number. Whatever I put on the blank on the left, I have to put the same thing on the blank on the right. The left side is already done for me. In my next step, my factoring is already completed. So all I have to do is add the 27 plus 9 on the right. 27 plus 9 gives me 36. Now I have something squared all by itself here. My parentheses squared are all alone, so I can get rid of the squared by taking a square root. Square root and squared cancel out, so I have x minus 3 equals. What's the square root of 36? What times itself gives me 36? It could be +6 or it could be -6. Don't forget both options. And then I have to move that 3 as my final step. So +3 to both of my options. So I get x could equal 9 or it could equal -3. So there are my two solutions. All right, hopefully you're getting the hang of this brand new method that combines factoring and square roots all in the same method. So just remember, your process is to add a blank to each side of the equation, use that bin squared shortcut to factor into your binomial squared, work backwards to fill in that blank. Whatever you put on the left has to go on the same spot, it has to also go on the right, right? And then at that point, you should have your factoring done, you square root both sides. Don't forget that you have a plus or a minus after you take your square root. And then just finish it out just like you did in the first lesson. All right, I know you can do it.